Joining us at this fair Facebook Live, and we are coming to you here from Washington, D.C. on a beautiful sunny day, and we're going to talk about two very important issues you may not have thought about, or maybe you thought about but weren't aware of some of the nuances, and we're going to get right down to it. The Trump administration has actually gone ahead, cut the refugee cap, okay? Refugee flows have been continuously going on in this country for some time, growing every year under President Obama, and President Trump has said, no, we're going to turn that around and bring the numbers down. He set a level of 18,000 refugee admissions in 2020, the lowest level seen in years. Now, there are some people complaining about that, and yet for some reason they don't seem to notice that we have had thousands and thousands of asylum seekers, many of them fraudulent of course, but coming across our southern border, caravans, organized smuggling rings, massive overloading of our asylum system. Everybody all around the world can see that the United States has done more than its fair share admitting so-called humanitarian refugee relief cases, and yet still there's complaints from Refugee Incorporated, these organizations that make a lot of money off resettling refugees, as well as communities that make a lot of money, complaining that the Trump administration has brought down these levels to provide a much-needed respite, to absorb and assimilate the refugees who come in the past, and to give us an opportunity to prioritize resources as a nation in favor of the massive backlog before the courts. So here to tell us a little bit more about that, Lew, what do you know about the decision to cut the refugee cap?
Well, I know that the decision was to reduce the refugee cap from 18,000 per year in the preceding fiscal year down to 18,000 per year from 30,000 in the preceding fiscal year. And I know that this has been called a steep drop, but that kind of gives away the game because actually the United States has for a very long time managed its refugee admissions, sometimes with even steeper drops. In fact,
well, if President Obama had had a third term, do we know what he would have requested in, say, 2016?
No, because in the last week, in the last week of President Obama's term, he dropped by about 50,000 the refugee cap for Cubans in particular. And yet at the same time, his administration increased the refugee cap up to 110,000, knowing that President Trump was coming in. So it's not clear whether President Obama, if he had a third term, hypothetically, would have wanted the refugees to be high at the level of 110,000, or if he wanted them to be low, consistent with that steep drop that he did for Cuban refugees in his last week in office. What we do know, though, is that he kicked the can down to President Trump, who is now having to deal with a refugee crisis, as you described, a backlog on our ability to even process these claims, let alone serve all these people who purport to be in deep need of help.
Well, yeah, the asylum backlog is what's really a problem. And asylum seekers are people who make a claim inside the United States or at a border. And refugee admission is a determination made outside the United States, sometimes through international organizations or non-government agencies. State Department allocates through a consultative mechanism with Congress a certain authorization for the certain number of refugees. Now, what do we know about the cost of resettling refugees through the refugee program? I'm not talking about asylum people now, but people who actually get these refugee admissions from overseas. What do we know about the costs of refugee admissions? Well,
we know it's high. The federal government doesn't do anything on the cheap. But one interesting fact that we know about these costs from information that FAIR has previously reported is that the places in the United States where these refugees tend to go are not often the same parts of the country where people complain the loudest about us not admitting enough refugees. So for example, parts of the South, parts of the Midwest, the Southwest, areas that you would electorally see as deep red states like Georgia take in more than their fair share of refugees. And yet places where some politicians have complained the loudest about how we treat detainees and refugees, such as New York, admit a much smaller number of these refugees.
Well, also jurisdictions that are depressed and they use the refugee admissions to get money, basically, federal money, all kinds of supported taxpayer-funded money to resettle refugees, provide housing assistance and other kinds of resettlement assistance. And these jurisdictions argue that it's important for their economy to actually resettle refugees. Have you heard about that?
I've heard about that, and it's a strange claim for a government agency to be making when it admits, on the one hand, how much money it spends in taxpayer funds to serve these people, and then at the same time claims that this is good for the economy. one fair...
The other question is that, I mean, in the end, too, is that we have our own refugees. I mean, in many of these communities, there are a lot of very poor people. You have a high poverty rate. And the question is, where should taxpayer-assisted money go, right? To people from outside the country or people here inside the country. And you think the administration would get some credit for balancing these various factors?
Yes, and the opposite seems to happen. So, for example, another thing the administration recently did was it clarified the so-called public charge rule, which says that if it appears that a person from another country will become dependent on our government, then they do not get to stay here for an extended period of time. And when the administration tried to take care that state agencies and federal agencies are prioritizing their welfare benefits toward the American citizens who need them, all of a sudden, there was a huge backlash against the Trump administration in the form of lawsuits claiming that, that illegal aliens in particular or non-citizens in general have a right to use public programs intended for Americans and then to stay here while they use those public programs. So in fact, even if a state agency wanted to help Americans instead of helping refugees, oftentimes the programs that serve Americans are in practice serving both Americans and non-citizens, including illegal aliens. And now some of these people want those resources to be allocated above that also toward refugee admissions.
Well, since you mentioned the public charge issue, I mean, you're an attorney. How is the average American supposed to feel? Donald Trump says, look, if you're going to go on welfare, if you're going to need medical services, you're not going to get a green card, you're not coming into the country. Unelected district judge turns around and issues a nationwide injunction and says, nah, it's not the case, even though the statute's pretty clear and given very broad discretion to the president in administering who gets visas and who doesn't. How's the average American supposed to feel about the court system at this point?
Well, the average American is supposed to feel very upset with what's happening in the court system because one of the main problems with these nationwide injunctions is that, ironically, it even prevents other courts from looking at the issue. So in theory, the way this is supposed to work is that a judge in California can give an injunction preventing the Trump administration from doing something. But a judge
in that district.
In that district, exactly. But a judge in Illinois ought to be able to review the case for himself instead of deferring to that injunction. And a judge in Texas ought to be able to do the same. And a judge in Maryland ought to be able to do the same. But instead what's happening is when a nationwide injunction happens, one court is taking for itself the responsibility to decide for the whole country how this proceeds. And that actually deprives the appellate courts and the Supreme Court of the opportunity to see how different judges in different parts of the country might approach this same question. And so even an American who believes that the Trump administration needs to be kept in check, and even an American who believes that the judiciary needs to be strong against a strong check and balance against presidential power, even such Americans should be opposed to nationwide injunctions because the system works better if the Supreme Court can simultaneously review different decisions happening around the country instead of a single low-level district judge deciding on his own what the policy is going to be around the country.
A lot of these nationwide injunctions have been issued by Obama appointees, right, on the bench?
That does seem to be the case, and there's a lot of good organizations out there who analyze.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah, but I mean, why doesn't the Supreme Court start to weigh in terms of like admonishing these district judges? This is an abuse of essentially of their authority to be issuing constantly these injunctions. Most of them seem to be in the immigration context, in an area where historically courts have been really loath to get involved in areas of presidential power involving things like border control, national defense, foreign policy. This seems to be a new bit of judicial adventurism unique to Trump and his administration.
Yes, data shows that the incidence of nationwide injunctions has spiked severely under this president. The silver lining, though, is that some appellate courts and the Supreme Court are admonishing lower courts for being too promiscuous in how they grant these nationwide injunctions. The president
they're obviously trying to, basically play a waiting game and hope that they can outlast the Trump administration, right?
Right,
It's like the Chinese.
in the trade war.
Right.
Right. It's a similar dynamic. Definitely, people sometimes abuse the litigation system just to slow things down, even the most basic common sense policies. So the Trump administration responds correctly when it petitions the Supreme Court to give fast track review to some of these nationwide injunctions.
On the top of your head, can you name major Trump policy decisions in immigration that have not been subject to some level of judicial challenge at this point?
Yeah, there's two decisions that came out in the last couple weeks that have in common.
Well, these are decisions. I'm saying have not actually been subject to any court challenge. In other words, have there been any major initiatives by the Trump administration in the immigration context that has not been subject to a lawsuit?
Yes, decisions by the Attorney General. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that the immigration courts in the United States are not actually courts devised under Article 3 of the Constitution.
3. Why do we need an immigration court system anyway? This is a civil benefit. It could be adjudicated by one hearing officer. Instead, we have this elaborate court system that's now completely imploded, overloaded with cases, not enough immigration judges. Taxpayers are supposed to continue to pay for unlimited levels of procedural process, for never-ending appeals, for every immigrant who wants to appeal to the Supreme Court or what have you, his or her right to stay in the country. And it's really not practical, right?
Right. But the Attorney General is supposed to oversee this system because a lot of these immigration judges...
You're saying it's not in the Article 3 federal court system. The immigration court system is within the Department of Justice.
That's right. And sometimes you see immigration judges who answer to the Attorney General misapplying the law. And recently, the Attorney General has issued 2 decisions correcting different ways in which immigration judges might be misapplying the law. One of these relates to deportation for people who have committed aggravated felonies. And another one of these relates to amnesty for people who show good moral character. Now, Congress has said that if you commit an aggravated felony, meaning, for example, a violent crime or a theft crime where the sentence was a year or longer, then you are deportable. And what has happened is when...
Congress very explicitly states the conditions under which you can't get a waiver. Aggravated felonies are a big deal.
That's right.
Right? And courts, when they sentence people, are considering the immigration consequences and changing their sentence, right?
That does happen.
Changing their sentence, knowing that there are immigration consequences, thereby putting an alien in a better position than a similarly situated citizen in that sentencing hearing who might not get that kind of leniency.
That's right. So in some jurisdictions, for example, Philadelphia, the district attorney hires at taxpayer expense a prosecutor whose sole job is to figure out how he might be able to plead down the charges when the defendant is an illegal alien or when the defendant is simply a non-citizen, and try to find a way for that person to get a lighter sentence than a citizen would get, just to spare that person from the consequences of deportation. But worse than that, even when a non-citizen is given an appropriate sentence, let's say a year or longer for a domestic violence crime, sometimes years after this is resolved, when the immigration court system finally gets around to deporting this person, that person's lawyer will go to a judge and say, can you retroactively change my sentence? That's already been over and done with years ago. Can you change it just to make it just short of a year, just a day short of a year, so that I don't get deported? And some judges have gone along with this, state court judges and immigration judges who are answerable to the Attorney General have respected that and have said, well, since the state court judge reduced this person's sentence a year later to just a day under a year, we're no longer going to treat that as an aggravated felony. And the Attorney General just recently decided that that practice is over. If a sentence has been altered for any reason other than an underlying defect in the conviction itself, such as the person shouldn't have been prosecuted in the first place because, let's say, maybe the evidence against them was totally made up, right? Mm-hmm. In a situation like that, the immigration judges are not going to deport a person because he shouldn't have been convicted in the first place. But if a conviction is altered for any other reason, especially if it's done for sparing a person from the immigration consequences, then the Attorney General is not going to allow state judges to do this kind of judicial amnesty and is instead going to proceed with deporting the convicted criminal.
And the Immigration Reform Law Institute weighed in with the Attorney General in support of his position, right?
Yes, we and a number of other representatives from different organizations contributed briefs for the Attorney General's office to review and decide what arguments they thought had the most merit. And the decision that the Attorney General ultimately came out with was one that we think is quite reasonable and consistent with what Americans would agree to be common sense immigration policy. Namely, if you come to this country and you commit violent crimes where you're sentenced to more than a year and you've had your day in court, the Attorney General ought to be able to deport you.
Oh, common sense. Oh, you're killing me with the common sense.
Well, the refugee issue is also one of common sense,
Apparently
right?
That doesn't matter anymore. But didn't Attorney General Jeff Sessions, use the same authority to come in and review a Board of Immigration Appeals decision on asylum, right, and change the standard back to where it ought to be? And that was subject to judicial challenge, and they overturned it. So why are we going to assume that the court system, the federal court system, the Article III court system, will allow the Attorney General to come in and change unilaterally the consequences of the sentencing procedure the way he has? I would assume there will be a lawsuit challenging the Attorney General's interpretation that that if a judge went ahead and changed the sentencing to try to save an alien from removal, deportation, that somehow the immigration courts, the immigration judges can ignore that and deport the guy anyway. You think the courts, the Article III courts, are going to put up with that diminution of their prerogative, their authority?
The short answer is no, because if they're applying the law faithfully, then they will prevent this kind of frivolous litigation that contradicts what Congress has said the deportation standards are, and what also contradicts the president's discretion, whom the American people have ultimately elected to be making these kinds of decisions in the first place. On the other hand, there's a lot of what we call forum shopping, which is activists looking around the country for the judges that are most willing to bend over backwards and give whatever kind of judicial order that an activist attorney might ask for. And the ultimate check on judges doing that is for the American citizenry to do what it can as citizens and to express their opinions, to vote, to learn about what's going on, so that in the long term, fewer and fewer of these kinds of judges are getting appointed who don't care about the law, and more judges are getting appointed who are willing to defer to what Congress has said the president should do and defer to the president and the Attorney General's judgment in keeping Americans safe.
All right, well, last question here, and I hope you find this interesting. I know we're getting a little in the weeds, but what do you think the consequences would be over time if the public were to lose confidence in the impartiality of our judicial system with these ongoing politicized injunctions and clear manipulation, political manipulation of the law, ignoring the law for partisan purposes?
Yeah, that's a scary question to try to answer. At a minimum, I think it's safe to say that if people see that the rule of law is not being respected, then they will respect it less themselves. And you can expect pretty much every aspect of society to deteriorate. Because if you think about it, so much of our ability to keep our families safe and to have a job and hold a job depends on everybody around us following the law, right? Imagine how many strangers you pass every day and how lucky you are every day that one of them declines to commit an act of violence against you. Well, obviously, if we are deporting fewer violent people, then the likelihood that you'll be the victim of violence goes up. If we see that welfare programs are being abused to serve those that don't actually deserve it, especially people who aren't even allowed to be in this country in the first place, well, then we can expect that Americans might become more willing to abuse welfare itself or less willing to pay their taxes, and the kinds of public services that we all sacrifice for as tax-paying citizens, we can expect the quality of that to diminish long-term as well.
All right, well, thank you, Lew. So to review what we talked about today, first was that the president has decreased the projected refugee admission level. That's for people who are resettled from overseas, who are deemed as qualified refugees, to 18,000, historically low for many, many years, saving taxpayers a lot of money and giving us the ability to prioritize people who've been coming across the border and claiming asylum by the hundreds of thousands, which was good. And then secondly, we've talked about how the Attorney General has appealed, taken under review two cases from the Board of Immigration Appeals to circumscribe the court's ability to prevent aliens from being removed who've committed crimes. So what Attorney General Barr has done here is made it easier to deport aggravated felons, criminal aliens that Congress has explicitly deemed removable. And so Bill Barr is doing good things there, and of course the President's doing good things on the refugee front. So, hope you found this interesting. I'm here with Lew Olowski with the Immigration Reform Law Institute, IRLI. Check out their website, irli.org. And of course, I'm Dan Stein, President of FAIR. Thank you for joining us.